Friendly fire is a horrible thing, and it's plagued armies for as long as ranged weapons have existed. And that's what makes things like heraldry and uniforms and the like so important. Even to this day, the dynamic between concealment and identification is a difficult one to strike. It's why you sometimes see troops in Ukraine wearing bright blue stripes around their otherwise camouflaged helmets and arms. And for narrative purposes, if you ever need to show someone off as being a real, unrepentant baddie, well, then you have them not care about friendly fire. Even worse, you have them fire directly on their own troops, uncaring of the lives of their men in pursuit of their personal greed or their hatred or whatever it is. But what if I told you that during the First World War, friendly fire wasn't just an unfortunate inevitability. Not only was it anticipated as something that would happen, but in a strange, roundabout kind of way, it could actually be almost desirable. It could actually be considered a good thing, almost. Now, does that sound like madness? Well, perhaps it was, but it was a necessary madness. And in this video, brought to you by the Native Oak and our mission to use public history to promote the national good through accessible education and charitable donations, we're going to explore the question of friendly fire by artillery in the First World War, how it happened, and why it was actually necessary to save lives. And to help demonstrate my point before we get to the sources, I'm actually going to turn to one of my favorite video games, The Great War Western Front. That's not a sponsorship, but hey, call me, always willing to talk. So you can see here we have a single enemy trench with one infantry company defending it, supported by a single machine gun. No wire, no supporting trenches, no bunkers for them to take cover in. Obviously, this is a much weaker position than a real World War I trench would be, but it's only for demonstration, so that's okay. Now I'm going to hit this position with artillery, a lot of it, and you can see how it is really wreaking havoc on them. By the time that barrage is over, less than a quarter of the enemy strength remains alongside their one machine gun, which I didn't manage to take out. So once again, I think we're being really quite generous to the attackers. I probably outnumber them around 10-1 at this point. But then, you see the enemy machine gun opens fire as soon as my men get into range, and it's soon joined by the enemy's small arms as well. Now, there are not a lot of Germans, but they're shooting rapid-firing, highly accurate, modern rifles, and my men are charging across open ground with little to no cover. It doesn't take long for them to be thwarted in their attack. Something isn't working here. Even though my artillery weakened the enemy by way more than would have ever actually happened in real life, even though this defensive position is so much weaker than would have been the case in reality, well, still, it really didn't take much for them to defeat my advancing forces from their entrenchments. So let's try this again, but this time, rather than having my infantry step off after the artillery have finished firing, and it would be safe for them, presumably, I'm actually going to have my infantry step off first, and then I'm going to begin the barrage. The Germans are able to peel off a few rounds here and there, but for the most part, you can see that the continual fire is able to keep them suppressed. My men reach the enemy positions right when the artillery stops firing and are able to take out the machine gun before it can offer much resistance. Likewise, while the Germans manage to take their firing steps, they're only able to shoot off a few rounds before my men are in their trenches. The Germans actually suffered less casualties from the artillery than before, but because the artillery was keeping their heads down, they weren't able to shoot at me, and my infantry are in their trenches before they know it, then able to use their superior numbers to quickly take control of the position. The key here was the timing of that attack, the close cooperation between infantry and artillery, which was one of the most important elements of the real war, which would seek to have artillery suppressing the enemy positions until the last possible moment when the infantry could pounce on them. However, of course, as great as this game is, it obviously isn't a one-to-one. Not only would the real battles be infinitely more complex and the defenses far better designed, but I also have a perfect bird's eye view of everything. I can order my men to do whatever I need them to do instantly, including redirecting the artillery with just the click of a button. The artillery here is also much more accurate than it was in reality. Because while here I select a little circle and basically all of the rounds are going to fall within that precise circle, well, in real life, it was never so simple. The guns weren't as accurate as that, and the means for the artillery to aim were much more limited. A significant number of rounds would naturally overshoot their target, landing useless in the fields beyond the enemy trenches. A significant number would also, you may imagine, fall short of their target. And when the infantry are advancing just behind that artillery to make sure that the enemy can't have enough time to prepare between the bombardment and the infantry attack, well, any round that does fall short is inevitably going to fall among the attackers. Now, when I said before that this form of friendly fire would be nearly a good thing, well, the word nearly there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. What was actually desirable was that the artillery is going to be firing until the last possible moment to keep the enemy suppressed, but that also inherently meant that some of those shells would fall short and kill their own men. But in order to actually prove that this was actually the case, that this was a prevailing thought of the time, we're going to need a lot more than my conjecture and a flawed test in a video game. We're going to need to look to the sources, which is exactly what we're going to do, of course, right after a brief sponsored message. Thank you to Exter for sponsoring this video. Come on, closer. That is a wild Exter wallet. Now, they're very rare in the wild. Let me see if I can... Oh, it's okay there. I can bring it up to you a little bit closer to show. If you look here at a smooth, sleek, very modern sort of design, they're very rare in the wild, but you'll notice it's so much more slim than your modern bifolds tends to be, right? I should say the old bifolds. The bifolds are the outdated. This is the new one. It's much more sleek and modern than a bifold, and yet, if we push this little button right here, it's called the quick card access. Let's see if it works. So it does. The Exter wallet is capable of carrying up to 12 cards plus cash. I never have any cash to put in the thing, but it can carry cash as well. See this little strap right here? Keeps it nice and closed. Little spoiler of my driver's license there. You may be wondering how rare they are. How was I able to find it? Well, of course, it's because you can throw in... Oh, I don't have my phone. You have my phone. It has a finder card that you can put inside the wallet, which you can use to track the wallet with your phone, which I was going to show you. But you have my phone recording, so we can't do that. They come in different colors. You see, this one's like more metallic, and it's blue, and it's skinnier, and yet, smaller size, it can still carry all of those cards. The Exter wallet, you can use my code in the description down below, branded at up to 50% off during the Black Friday sale. It makes for an amazing gift. I actually do, now, as I throw it in the dirt, this one actually is my personal wallet. I use it every day. It's a very nice product, and that's the ad. Thank you for sponsoring. Link in the description down below. Thank you to Exter for your extraordinary patience with my very, very silly advertisements, and that's a positive way of putting it. Well, again, you can get up to 50% off of your Exter order by following the link in the description down below and using my code at checkout during their Black Friday sale. Really is a good product. I enjoy it. I do use it every day. I think it'd be a good gift idea. But with that, my dear friends, let us return to the subject at hand and those aforementioned primary sources. For example, we can look to the infantry drill regulations of the United States Army 1911, which was then updated in 1918 with lessons from the war. It describes, in very plain English, how troops should be accustomed to being fired over by friendly artillery and impressed with the fact that the artillery should continue firing upon the enemy until the last possible moment. The few casualties resulting from shrapnel bursting short are trifling compared with those that would result from the effectiveness of the enemy's infantry fire were the friendly artillery to cease firing. Another similar description can be found in the International Military Digest, published in 1916. Not an official military-issued document in this case, of course, but still a contemporary examination of military science and best practice, which was being edited and written by military experts of the time, as you can see here by this specific volume's staff. In regards to artillery cooperating with an infantry assault, it also prescribes them to intensify the fire when the attacking troops disclose themselves, continue it until the last moment, then raise the range, firing against hostile forces behind the front line. Our losses from abnormal and erroneous shots will be trifling compared to those inflicted by an enemy freed from such an artillery attack by the premature cessation of its fire. So as is typically the case with the First World War, it's going to be tempting, I'm sure, for many people to jump to conclusions about how all of this wasn't necessary, to decry artillery commanders as inept, as refusing to adapt, or as being uncaring for the lives of their fellow soldiers. But as is typically the case, especially in the First World War, that's simply not true. And when you examine both more modern historiography and the words of the people who were actually there when they were there, without that, immortal hindsight, well, you'll find that, there were massive concerns with this, trying to limit the friendly fire as much as possible, but always without sacrificing that necessary intensity of the artillery's support. Just because this stuff was in the manuals doesn't mean that it was, found to be acceptable or desirable even, only that on the ground it was the reality, right? The job of the army wasn't to be idealistic, to take a stance of, we must never have one of our boys, be killed by a British shell. We need to do everything we can. Like, that's not realistic. Realistically speaking, if the number is 15% and you can get it down to 5% friendly casualties, those are exaggerations, I'm sure. That's just me throwing out random numbers. But if it's one number and you can reduce it to another, fantastic. Do whatever you can to make that the case, but don't, shoot yourself in the foot, in an attempt to not shoot yourself in the foot, if that makes sense. The artillery, though, they would, their job was to be pragmatic about it, right? They would expend significant time and resources trying to figure out better paths. They were constantly improving on, things, on various elements to their art, but every experiment also cost them lives, right? And in this case, if the artillery happened to misjudge the situation, well, a simple mathematical error could wind up killing a lot of people. Now, I won't get into all of the science that went into this stuff, not because it doesn't exist, but because I wouldn't understand most of it, and I don't want to turn this into a 3-hour-long study of trigonometry, right? Whatever trigonometry even is. But what I can do is at least get you a more general sense for some of the considerations that people had with all this by quoting from the War Manual, published in 1916, where the author describes how whether the artillery can continue its fire until the assaulting infantry is actually on the point of closing with the enemy, or whether it should increase its range on the first signs of the commencement of the assault, must depend on the circumstances of each case. The distance between the combatants just prior to the assault and the slope of the ground are important factors. Where the ground in front of the enemy's position is steep and broken, this distance will probably be short. But a steep slope gives a better view to the artillery, and small errors in elevation will not be so dangerous to the infantry as on flat ground. If the ground is flat and exposed, the infantry may be compelled to assault from further off, while the artillery will experience increased difficulties in estimating the relative positions of the combatants, and errors in elevation and view setting will be more dangerous to the attacking infantry. The advantages of artillery support at this period are, however, so great that the danger from a few shells falling short must not be allowed to prevent the artillery from continuing their fire until the latest possible moment. By changing from time shrapnel to percussion shrapnel, it may be possible to defer the moment when the artillery must cease firing at the immediate objective of the infantry. When it is no longer possible to continue firing at that objective, the range of the artillery should be increased so as to search the rear of the position, but no considerable amount of ammunition should be devoted to this object. To try and limit this friendly fire as much as possible, coordination between the artillery and the advancing infantry was paramount. Things like creeping, rolling, and box barrages were all constantly being worked on and tweaked and improved so that by the end of 1916 or so, they were actually really quite precise tools, as much as they were able to be with the technology of the time. Likewise, the level of command and control for the infantry would constantly be getting smaller throughout the First World War, placing more and more emphasis on subalterns and NCOs rather than on captains trying to control entire companies at once. But at the end of the day, those sorts of preparations could only really take the men so far in actual combat, and close communication between the two arms was incredibly important as a result of it. You can plan until the cows come home, but when you're actually there on the field, it's a different animal, and you need to be able to communicate as well as you were able to. But unfortunately, during the First World War, communications technology hadn't quite caught up with the scale of conflict, and most of those communications had to be visual. The infantry drill regulations that I mentioned earlier recommended that infantry use a preconcerted signal, typically with a 4-foot signal flag. You can imagine how that could potentially go wrong in a battle, right? The more recently published British Army Handbook, 1914 to 1918, an amazing piece written by Andrew Rawson, which I'll link down below, it describes another popular method, maybe a little bit more reliable, but only if the lighting is right, of using differently colored flares, fired from rifle grenade launchers in order to communicate with the artillery. And then, of course, there are the more classic, yet much more delayed methods, like using riders and runners, dogs and pigeons, and the like. The artillery as well is going to be dedicating significant efforts to improving their signaling capabilities, including constantly working to improve their ranging equipment, to get more and better signalers and runners and the like, as well, of course, as using observation balloons and even aeroplanes for their spotting. But ultimately, all of these methods had a natural ceiling of effectiveness, and until every infantry unit could reliably be carrying a radio, so in other words, not during the First World War, well then reliable instant communication was impossible. Miscommunication and misunderstanding as such were inherent. In his book, Amisicide, The Problem of Friendly Fire in Modern War, published in 1982, Charles Schrader describes how, by 1914, artillery weapons had reached their technological adolescence, but were still far from consistent in accuracy and reliability. Communication, an essential element of indirect fire control, was also of limited perfection. Tactical doctrine for the employment of indirect fire artillery weapons, however, had evolved more rapidly and threatened to outstrip the available technology. Incidents of artillery amisicide, due to inadequate communications, poor survey and fire control, and the sheer volume of artillery fire called for by the prevailing tactical doctrine, became so common in World War I as to be an almost unremarkable aspect of the war on the Western Front. Post-war memoirs of participants on both sides attest to the frequency with which troops were fired upon by their own artillery. Indeed, when estimating the probable human cost of an offensive operation, the thorough staff planner usually included an allowance for casualties due to a friendly barrage. One French general, he says, estimated a total figure of 75,000 French casualties owing to friendly fire, although the true number really is impossible to determine with any certainty. A fun little anecdote that I got from the book. Supposedly the 49th Regiment of German Field Artillery was wryly known as the 48.5 Regiment for their tendency to shoot short. And because of these difficulties, it became important for infantry officers, and to an extent the men themselves, to become very well acquainted with the personalities, if you will, of the different types of shells, and to be familiar with the precise details of every planned action. It was also important for them to understand the nature of the artillery and how it worked, what its job was, and how it anticipated that a few rounds must fall short in order to prevent the infantry from panicking and sending off a bad message for the artillery to extend their range when it wasn't actually necessary. After all, such an extension could prove disastrous if it came too early. The guidebook Safety in Trench Warfare for Yourself and Your Men, published in 1918, advised men on what to expect when advancing under shrapnel rounds, wherein, of course, the round itself is going to burst in the air before the shots themselves would keep on going to a more forward position. So given that is being the case, if you're on the ground and the shrapnel shots are going on above you, well, what should you be keeping an eye out for? What should you expect in order to make sure that you are behind those shrapnel rounds landing, but not too far behind them? When the barrage is shrapnel, the air bursts are, of course, short of the actual strike of the bullets, up to as much as 75 yards short, even for good bursts at the lower ranges of battle conditions, and more than this for high bursts. If you are really close enough to the barrage, almost a quarter of the bursts should be overhead or behind you. The whole problem of getting protection from a barrage lies in how close you can keep up to it without running more risk from it than it saves you from by keeping the enemy's head down until you're on top of them. As such, the author explains, it was of vital importance that officers and NCOs get a good sense for the timing and range of these different shells so that they understood where they should be going and where to avoid, which he dedicates significant time to going through every different shell type and everything later on in the book. Another book, The Manual of the Chief of Platoon of Infantry, a French piece actually, published in 1917 and translated a year later into French, advises the exact same thing, warning individuals that the shells of a well-adjusted fire do not, therefore, all fall upon the same point. A certain percentage of their fall is short or over. This the infantry must know, so as to not ask the artillery to lengthen a well-adjusted fire should a few fall short in the vicinity of the infantry trenches. Infantry that makes premature or unjustified complaints against its artillery spoils the fire of the latter and diminishes to its own disadvantage the support which it would otherwise receive. Moving the great guns, having them sight and range in on new positions, that's not an easy or a fast task, even if there was perfect communication between the two arms. So, if the infantry have a few rounds land short and they panic as a result of that, they send out a message to move up the artillery, but then the artillery moves up too far and they have to send another message to bring the artillery back because now they're under small arms fire that's even worse than a few rounds falling short. Well, you can see how not only is that going to get really confusing really quickly, but also how just the time alone it's going to take for the artillery to move back and forth if they even obey the requests of the infantry. Well, it's going to be all during that time the artillery isn't going to be firing. It just leads to disaster in one respect or another. Say the infantry, continually send up false messages like, oh, hey, you're firing on us, when it was just a few rounds falling short. Well, then one day the artillery might actually be firing on them, little boy who cried wolf, right? Now, to this end, I've got yet another book for you, With the British on the Somme, published 1917, which says that success depends largely on squaring and timing the artillery fire with the infantry advance, and the progress of the troops must depend on 100 circumstances beyond previous calculation. Those that are delayed face an enemy no longer worried by shells and endure the full handicap of the attack. The artillery cannot wait for them, or alter the program, or attend to infantry signals which may be bogus or mistaken. Remember, all these primary sources are free to read over at nativeoak.org if you're so inclined. But, okay, with all this having been said, so what? What would happen if the artillery did lift too early? Would it really be that bad? How severe was this handicap of the attacker that it would justify the artillery hitting some of its own men? Well, back to the same book we go for a rather interesting perspective on that question. The effect of the clamor and tumult is incommunicable in words and impossible to render in sensation, but the most terrible noise was not from the guns. At the moment when our artillery lengthened their fuses and lifted the fire to allow our men to charge, the rattle of the German machine guns then burst out at our charging troops and absolutely drowned the artillery. Compare the size of the cannon and the detonation of a shell with the little pop of a machine gun, and you will reach some idea of the volume of the fire. In spite of the intensity of the assault, the severest losses befell those who started later. Our artillery had lifted to more distant targets, the wind had cleared the field of smoke and dust. The German officers had reorganized their men for defense, and their artillery observers had a clearer field. The result was that any troops marching forward to answer the call of some distant signal drew every bullet before they ever reached the protection of an enemy's trench. Examples of exactly this kind of thing happening are sadly incredibly common in First World War narratives. Sometimes there are angry words for the artillery, these men with relatively cushy rear-line jobs causing the collateral damage through their lack of awareness of the situation over at the front. Not that those descriptions are actually very accurate. Being in the artillery was still a very dangerous job, and it was very hard work as well. But other times, soldiers would more describe the event with a kind of resigned acceptance, just another chaotic element of war's horrors. One rather funny view comes from the same author of the How to Survive in the Trenches book in his Artillery Experience of Shooting and Observation in Trench Warfare, where he describes how quite an unreasonable number of times I have been caught in a short burst from one of our shells, and with the bullets kicking up dust around one, it's amazing how often one remains untouched. That same author has a third book as well that I think would be perfect for this video, called Guns, Gunners, and Their Cooperation with Infantry, but unfortunately I couldn't find a copy of it online. If anyone happens to have access to a copy by chance, shoot me an email, let me know, and maybe I can have you take a few pictures of some pages or something. But ultimately, regardless of its tactical necessity, regardless of war's cold, utilitarian arithmetic that demands such sacrifices, however a man was killed, whether by an enemy shot or a friendly one, it was never an easy thing to process. If anything, it might have made things worse for those that they left behind if it was from a friendly shell. Tactical necessity is very rarely a comfort for those on the ground. And so I'd like to end this video with another primary account, an interview, actually, which I've nicked from the extraordinary podcast Voices of the First World War, which I'm, of course, going to link down below. And I encourage you to listen to the whole episode that it's from. It's a wonderful piece, really interesting insights. It's very powerful to listen directly to the voices of these individuals. These particular words are those of William Muir, describing an experience that he had during the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April of 1917.
I sent a signaller out in front of the wire. He went out, and while he was out, we were making do and having something to eat. Then, of course, our 18-pounders were firing short. They couldn't get the distance. They went as far as they could, and they were still firing. The 18-pounder gunners were falling short among us, and then we got the wind up, because we didn't know whether one of us was going to get it. And it wasn't long before one of us got it. It was, when he died, he just fell forward in front of me, and his head was blown off the top of the head, and the blood drenched me with his blood.
My name is Brandon Fischella. I'm with the Native Oak, an educational organization dedicated to promoting the study of military history and applying that interest for the national good. If you'd like to learn more about that mission, to read any of the sources you've heard from today via our free digital library, visit nativeoak.org. If you've enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy our new book, Something Like Philosophy. As ever, this content is only possible thanks to your viewership and support, and the generosity of our patrons. Thank you, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.